There are two figures from history that most people assume have nothing in common. One spent his life writing about inner peace, self-mastery, and the quiet strength of virtue. The other spent his life studying courts, kings, and the cold mechanics of power. One sounds like someone you would trust with your children. The other sounds like someone you would never fully trust at all. But if you look past the surface, past the labels and the reputations, something surprising emerges. These two men were asking the same question. How does a person survive a world that is often harsh, often unfair, and full of people who do not always mean well, without losing themselves in the process? One answered from the inside. He went deep into the nature of the mind, emotions, perception, and how the stories we tell ourselves shape everything we experience. The other answered from the outside. He watched human beings in motion, under pressure, chasing influence, protecting position, shifting loyalties when the stakes changed. One taught steadiness. The other taught clarity. And the deeper you go into both, the more you realize they are not opposites at all. They are two halves of the same understanding. Human psychology has not changed much across the centuries. The clothes are different. The technology is unrecognizable. But the fears, the ambitions, the pride, the jealousy, the desire to be seen, the terror of being left behind, all of it remains remarkably consistent. You see it in offices. You see it in friendships. You see it at dinner tables. The ancient world and the modern world are not as far apart as we like to think. One of the most important things the inner philosopher understood was something most people spend years resisting. Pain does not get better when you argue with it. A lot of people, when something goes wrong, enter into a kind of negotiation with reality. They replay the sequence of events. They rehearse conversations they wish they had. They ask why it happened, why to them, why now? And that question, sincere as it is, keeps them standing in place while everything around them continues to move forward. The world does not wait for you to finish grieving before it asks you to make another decision. Two people can go through the exact same loss and arrive at completely different places a year later. Not because one was stronger from the start, not because one was luckier, but because of what each one chose to do with the experience once the initial shock faded. One uses the pain as information. The other uses it as an identity. That difference compounds over time. The inner philosopher knew this from lived experience, not from a comfortable distance. He held one of the most demanding positions imaginable. Constant pressure, constant decisions, people around him who were unreliable or openly disloyal, and not a single day where the weight of responsibility lifted. He had every reason to be consumed by stress. Instead, he wrote to himself in private, reminders to slow down before reacting, to resist the pull of catastrophizing, to treat each difficult moment not as punishment, but as material. Material for building something stronger. The obstacle, he believed, is not separate from the path. It is the path. The thing standing in your way is also the thing that, if you move through it honestly, shapes you into someone more capable. A business that collapses is showing you something about the model, about the market, about your own assumptions. A relationship that ends, however painfully, is revealing something true about compatibility or timing that staying would have continued to obscure. A job that disappears may be the only thing that would have ever pushed you toward where you actually needed to go. None of that makes loss pleasant, but it changes what the loss means. Pain stops being a sign that something went wrong with the universe and starts being a signal worth decoding. He also wrote about the distortion that urgency creates. The argument that feels career-ending this week will be a distant memory in 3 years. The person whose opinion felt devastating will stop mattering. The humiliation that seemed permanent will fade into something you barely remember. That is not minimizing what you feel. It is giving yourself a longer lens so that short-term emotion does not make long-term decisions for you. And on the subject of impermanence, he came back to it constantly. The painful stretch you are in right now has an end. The people making your life difficult will move on. The circumstances that feel locked in place are, almost without exception, temporary. Holding that truth does not erase the discomfort. It just keeps you from treating something temporary as though it were a life sentence. The response to pain is what defines you, not the pain itself. Being able to feel something genuinely difficult without letting it commandeer your choices is one of the most valuable capacities a person can develop. And it is a practice, not a gift. Something you build through repetition, through catching yourself before you react, through choosing your next step rather than just having one. The outer strategist approached the human world from a completely different angle. He watched, observed, and recorded what people actually do when the pressure goes up, when something worth wanting appears on the horizon, when self-interest enters the room. And what he found was consistent enough to build a framework around. Goodness does not automatically protect you. That is a hard thing to hear, because most of us were raised on the idea that honesty and loyalty produce the same in return. Sometimes they do. But loyalty is a conditional thing for most people, even for people who genuinely believe they are loyal. When the stakes shift, priorities follow. The person who praised your work generously for years may quietly become your competition the moment something worth competing for becomes available. That is not necessarily a revelation about their character. It is a revelation about human nature under pressure. The strategist was not advocating for cynicism. He was advocating for accuracy. He believed that the people most likely to get hurt are the ones who refuse to observe the patterns in front of them because they want things to be a certain way. Wanting someone to be trustworthy is not the same as having evidence that they are. Hoping a situation will stay stable is not a substitute for watching what it actually does over time. He paid attention to behavior in moments of change. Who shows up when things get hard? Who changes their tone when someone more powerful walks into the room? Who becomes less available, less generous, less warm the moment the dynamic shifts? Words can be shaped to fit any occasion. Behavior under pressure is much harder to fake. He also wrote about disclosure and the risks of openness. In a world that rewarded honesty at every turn, sharing everything would be the right strategy. But that is not always the world we operate in. There are people who use what you share, not against you on purpose, but simply because information creates leverage, and leverage gets used. Choosing to be quiet is not deception. It is discernment. Knowing what to say, to whom, and at what point in a relationship is not dishonesty. It is judgment. He also warned about the danger of dependence. When a single person controls your reputation, your income, your access to opportunity, you are only ever one relationship shift away from a serious problem. That is not pessimism. That is risk management. Spread carefully. Build redundancy into the things that matter. And then there is the trap of eagerness to please. When the people around you understand that your primary need is to avoid conflict, they learn something useful. They learn that the terms of any agreement can be renegotiated by simply applying social pressure. They learn that your standards are flexible if they push in the right way. And the person who started out wanting to be liked finds themselves quietly overrun, resentful, and unsure of how they got there. The way out is not to become hard. It is to become clear. Clear about what you will and will not accept. Clear enough that the people around you understand where the line is before they test it. There is a version of confidence most people mistake for the real thing. It is the kind that needs constant confirmation. It rises with praise and collapses with criticism. It gets threatened by disagreement and reads being ignored as an emergency. The inner philosopher recognized this pattern in himself and worked against it systematically, not because he was naturally calm, but because he understood the damage that self-centered reactions cause. The ego does a very specific thing during conflict. It tells you that winning the argument is the same as being right. It tells you that the last word matters. It transforms minor friction into personal battles, small slights into major offenses, ordinary feedback into attacks. And once the ego is in charge of a situation, clear thinking leaves the room. There is a difference worth drawing carefully here. Arrogance says I am beyond your opinions because I am better than you. That is ego dressed as confidence. Genuine steadiness says whether you approve of me or not is beyond my control, and I am not going to let it destabilize me. Those two things feel similar from the outside, but they come from completely different places, and they hold up very differently under real pressure. The inner philosopher also pointed out something uncomfortable about fame and approval. Both are unreliable. The people celebrating you today may be criticizing you 6 months from now for reasons that have very little to do with anything you actually did. If your self-worth depends on something that unstable, you will spend your whole life managing how you appear rather than developing who you actually are. Anchoring your confidence to your own values and your own behavior, rather than to how the room responds to you at any given moment, produces a kind of stability that most people do not encounter very often in others. It does not need to perform. It does not panic when ignored. It can sit with criticism, consider it honestly, and respond with thought rather than reflex. That is genuinely rare. And it begins with asking an honest question when emotion flares. Does this actually matter, or does it only feel that way right now? The outer strategist made a parallel observation from a completely different direction. Emotional predictability is a liability. If someone knows what gets under your skin, that knowledge becomes leverage. If someone knows you make impulsive moves when you feel cornered, they can create the conditions for that to happen on purpose. They do not even have to plan it consciously. People are remarkably good at learning what makes others react and using that knowledge intuitively. The steadiest person in any room carries a significant advantage, not because they feel nothing, but because they do not broadcast everything they feel the moment they feel it. Composure is strategic. It protects your options. It keeps people from being able to predict you accurately. It makes you significantly harder to manipulate. Real control is not suppression. People who hold everything inside do not become calm. They become pressurized, and eventually they fracture at the worst possible moment over something far too small to deserve it. What actually works is simpler. Feel what you feel. Name it honestly to yourself. And then choose your response rather than simply having one. That can happen in minutes if you make it a habit. Most people never do, which is why most people remain reactive their whole lives. Here is where these two philosophies meet and why they need each other. If you follow only the inner path, acceptance, equanimity, releasing attachment, you can drift into a kind of softness that leaves you vulnerable. You rationalize patterns that should concern you. You keep extending trust that has already been broken. You mistake conflict avoidance for wisdom, and eventually someone walks right through your openness without much effort. If you follow only the outer strategy, awareness of angles, guarded trust, watching everything for hidden motives, you eventually arrive at isolation. You see manipulation in every warm gesture. You overcalculate every relationship. You stop being able to simply be with people because the analytical part of your brain never turns off. That is not sharpness. That is loneliness in disguise. The balance is where real capability lives. Someone's behavior starts to feel inconsistent. Their words and their actions are pointing in different directions. Something registers as off without being obviously explainable. The pure acceptance response says, people are imperfect. Focus on what you control. Do not disturb yourself. The pure strategic response says, assume bad intent. Withdraw. Protect yourself immediately. The balanced response says, stay calm. Do not make sudden moves. Pay close attention over time. Let the evidence build without projecting a conclusion before you have enough information to reach one honestly. That is what it looks like when both of these ways of seeing the world operate together. Grounded enough to think without panic. Clear-eyed enough to see what is actually in front of you without distortion in either direction. People who carry both of these qualities do not usually announce them. They do not tell you they are calm, or that they see clearly, or that they are hard to manipulate. You simply notice. They do not take bait. They do not unravel when criticized. They make decisions without excessive drama. They hold their position without needing you to validate it. And over time, that becomes the thing people trust them for. Not their willingness to please, but their consistency, their honesty, and the sense that they are the same person regardless of who is watching. That is what both of these philosophies were pointing toward in their very different ways. Not a perfect person, a more complete one. Someone who has done the work on the inside and the work on the outside simultaneously, without sacrificing either for the sake of the other. Life has not changed in the ways that matter most. Pressure still warps priorities. Ambition still strains loyalty. Fear still produces poor decisions. Pride still clouds judgment. And most people, caught in those forces, lose their balance somewhere along the way. They become too reactive or too passive, too suspicious or too trusting, too focused on approval or too hardened against needing it at all. The goal is neither detachment nor paranoia. It is calmness combined with awareness. Discipline paired with realism. Confidence that does not depend on the room agreeing with you. The next time something genuinely frustrates you, do not respond in the first moment. Let the initial wave settle. Then ask yourself what the most useful move actually is. That simple pause is the inner philosophy working in real time. And the next time someone's behavior starts to feel inconsistent, when what they say and what they do are not quite matching, resist the urge to immediately explain it away. Just watch a little longer. Let the pattern speak for itself before you draw a conclusion. That is the outer awareness doing what it is designed to do. Neither of those habits requires you to become a different person. They just require more intention than most people bring to those moments. And applied consistently, over time, they compound into something substantial. You become steadier. You see more clearly. You are harder to rattle, harder to mislead, and more honest with yourself about the world you are actually living in, not the one you wish it were. That, in the end, is the whole point. Not philosophy for its own sake. Not strategy for the sake of winning. Just the clearest, most grounded, most complete version of yourself you can build, one honest moment at a time.